Hello and welcome back to another episode of the CanMar Morning Talk Show. I'm your host, Louie, and today's guest is Andrew DeAngelo. Andrew is one of the most dedicated cannabis advocates that I have ever seen. He's worked on legalizing the plant, he's owned dispensaries, he was a star in the television docuseries Weed Wars, and he's now working on getting marijuana prisoners out of prison and reintegrated back into society. Andrew has done so much for the cannabis industry that I don't think enough people realize. And I hope this episode will give you a glimpse into just how impactful his career has been. So, without further ado, I hope you enjoy this episode of the CanMar Morning Talk Show with Andrew DeAngelo. All right, we are live with another episode of the CanMar Morning Talk Show with Andrew DeAngelo. Andrew, how are you doing?
Good morning. Nice to be with you today.
Yeah, excellent to have you here. Firstly, I want to thank you for joining us. And I want to ask you the same question I ask all of our guests, which is, how did you find your way to cannabis?
Well, I have an older brother who got into cannabis before I did. So he was my guide and the person that first introduced me to cannabis. I was very fortunate. So it wasn't like someone handed me a joint at a concert or something like that, which sometimes is a great experience, but sometimes can be a little overwhelming if you don't have the right setting, for your first experience there. So my older brother Steve did that for me. I was in high school. I was going through a lot of physical and emotional pain at the time because I was an athlete and I had an injury, so I I had to give up a dream. And he handed me a joint, and a little voice inside my head said, "You should take that joint," and I did. And not just my physical pain, but my emotional pain was eased and soothed with that joint. And cannabis has been a great friend and teacher to me ever since.
Right. And, you mentioned set and setting, and I think it is important to contextualize cannabis in a sense, because for a lot of people, that context of their first time is a bit anxiety inducing in the sense that cannabis is illegal. It's frowned upon, especially, a few decades ago, it was very frowned upon. So did your brother set cannabis up as this is a good thing, don't pay attention to what you hear about it? Or did he just say, try this, see how it goes?
No, my brother was dealing weed and being an activist since I was 6 or 7 years old. So I was always taught by him that cannabis was a good thing, not a bad thing, and that he was very open with me about what he did for a living. And so when it came time for me to have that joint in my mom's kitchen, that setting was pretty good. I was at inside the home I grew up with. We could go upstairs and be alone, and as brothers hang out in the place we grew up with while I was having my first experience with cannabis. So that was a really good setting with the right person, right? You want to be with someone you trust, someone you're close to. And so if you do get a little anxious, or if you maybe took a little too much your first time, there's someone to sort of guide you. That's why I say guide. It very much is a guide that first, maybe even first few experiences. And start off slow. Take one or two little puffs, or 1 or 2 milligrams of an edible, and see how you feel. And you can always take more. It's you can't really take less.
And you've played a really pivotal role in the cannabis culture and industry in the United States, much more than I think a lot of people realize. But I want to ask you first, how did you make the transition or the decision to go from consuming cannabis and enjoying it to effectively making cannabis and its legalization your life's goal?
Well, it's a great question. It's a fun story. When I was coming up, I was in high school in the 1980s. So that was Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and a very conservative time in both our countries with respect to drugs, and very harsh sentences, very dangerous time to be trading cannabis or growing cannabis. So that's the environment I came up with. I was a little bit crazy. And so I sold weed in the dormitories of where I went to college. But you couldn't study how to be a weed dealer. You couldn't study. There was no legal cannabis industry. You couldn't say, well, I'll study business. I'll apply it to weed. You couldn't really do that in those days. So I wanted to be an actor. So I studied acting. And in fact, in 1987, I came to London on a theater tour where I got to see some of the great actors of the English stage perform some of the classics of Shakespeare and other classic authors. So that was my first. I was sort of trying to be a creative, but also selling weed to all the other creatives that I was working with. That was sort of how I figured it out. But it was hard because I had to hide all that from the world. I had to be in a closet and about it, and in the creative community, these rumors go around about you. And so it can have an impact on one's career in those days if you're trying to have like a straight mainstream career, which I was as an actor. But then once we were able to legalize cannabis in California for medical purposes in 1996, now I'm pushing 30 years old, and now okay, I can maybe do some legal cannabis businesses. And even though I didn't have that background and training in business school, neither did Steve. I'd been selling weed for a long time, so I kind of knew the ins and outs of the very basics of supply and demand, and how to trade something. Got very good at how to hide while you're trading that something, and that then eventually we were able to open Harborside in California, which is a medical cannabis chain of dispensaries. We also have a farm and brands now, and we're in more than one state and publicly traded in Canada, and big giant company now. And we're not part of the company anymore, but obviously still big shareholders of the company. But the journey has been a long one, and now I'm proud and happy to say I can now I'm a consultant in the cannabis industry, and in fact have one or two clients in England even on the CBD side of things, and it's been that's really fun because now I get to work on building the global cannabis industry, not just one company, or one family business like I did with my brother and I for decades. And I'm having a blast doing that. And, the wins, even in a place like England, it's very hard, in the UK right now, but still progress is being made. Wouldn't you? I think so, right? And the wind is more at our backs than in front of our faces. I think a little bit.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I'm in Australia. I'm not sure if you.
Oh, okay. Australia's doing all right. I mean, not the best framework.
No, we're quite slow. We're quite slow.
You're exporting most of your weed, right? Now,
Yeah,
that's a bummer.
yeah.
But I know people in Australia too that are there's some Neville Shoemakers from Australia. He recently passed away, but people there's a lot of good genetics and great cannabis tradition in Australia.
There is, and there is a lot of growth. Like the medicinal numbers are growing quite exponentially, but yeah, the framework is very rigid and regulatory. Recreational legalization seems quite a while away,
Yeah,
unfortunately. But I want to get to before we talk about Harborside, which was your, I think, first like legal dispensary endeavor, and maybe one of the first. You also helped to propel legalization in many ways, I think throughout the 90s and probably still to this day. Can you talk a bit about those efforts?
sure. Yeah, when I went to acting school actually in San Francisco, I got to meet a guy named Dennis Perone. This is the late '80s, early '90s, and he was the pioneer of legalizing medical cannabis in San Francisco. At that time, the AIDS epidemic was ravishing San Francisco and the gay community, and his lover ended up dying of AIDS. But when he was very sick, he noticed that cannabis was keeping him alive, and was reducing the wasting syndrome and things like that. So he began this crusade when his lover died to legalize medical cannabis, to try to pay attention to this epidemic. No one was paying attention to it at that time. The government wouldn't even say the word HIV or AIDS at that time. So it was a really hard time in that community. So they're the ones that pioneered it. My brother and I were on the East Coast. We were, supporting the effort from afar. I was in acting school in San Francisco still. I was helping collect signatures. My brother was sending Dennis money. A whole bunch of people from all over the country were sending Dennis money. And first he legalized in 1992 in San Francisco, just the city. They have an initiative process in San Francisco. You pass a law in San Francisco if you get enough signatures on the ballot, and he did, and the law passed. So, and then he opened his first dispensary, and I was hanging out as a young man and activist there, and trying to sell him weed, which I ended up buying more weed from him than selling it. But in any case, that was the first dispensary, and then we went for the statewide initiative in 1996 that Dennis again led the charge on that. By this time, I'm back east. I'm out of acting school. I'm working with my brother, and we have a legal hemp company, a clothing company that's making out of hemp clothing in Europe mostly. Unfortunately, not Australia, but Europe, and a little bit of China, and we were making hemp. So we were supporting the effort in California, and then that law passed in 1996, and that was really the watershed moment. That was the first time legalization had cracked the wall of prohibition for, I don't know, almost 75 years or something, 70 years, and then other states started to pass medical. Colorado came next, and not for a while, for 10 or 12 years, 15 years. But Colorado came next, Washington State came next. Then they were the first to legalize for adults, Colorado and Washington. And then California was able to do that. And now a whole bunch of other states have been able to do that. So it's really been a domino effect all the way across. My brother and I were there in the beginning. We still work on it. We're working on New York right now. We were helping the activists improve the frameworks. In New York, there was a bad framework in New York just until a few months ago, and we rallied the troops, and we were able to improve the framework. Now, New York has one of the best frameworks in the world, especially for small businesses, for social equity, Black and brown people who've been harmed by the war on drugs and the war on weed in particular. So the frameworks are really good. We're really excited about New York. So. That's on the activist side. That's what we've done. And then on the entrepreneurial side, you're an activist so that you don't have to be a criminal, so you can basically sell weed and work with this plant. That's where the real joy comes from. The politics is really kind of a drag, and it's hard work, and just you lose more than you win. It's just difficult, right? In Australia, it's hard. But that's what you have to do in order to do the fun stuff. So and the interesting stuff. So luckily we did enough activism that we were able to open Harborside. Harborside was one of the first 6 licensed dispensaries in the world in Oakland, California. Oakland was the first municipality to have the courage to license cannabis after the framework passed in '96. This is going all the way to like '04 now. It took 8-10 years for somebody to be brave enough to license a dispensary, even though the voters voted for it. And we were skillful enough to get one of the licenses. And then, we created a model that people really responded to, and patients and the community really loved. And Harborside became world famous and still is. And so, and now I help other people do that, all over the world, the same thing. Hopefully Australia will be able to have dispensaries someday and retail outlets, and not just export everything. I think you export everything that you grow there now, or pretty much all of it. And domestically, it's just very hard to get unless you're really, really sick, I think. So, this work continues in a lot of places, but all over the world, this is happening, and Australia will get there, and I'd love to come build a beautiful dispensary that all walks of life feel comfortable in.
Yeah, we'd love to have you here. It is, like I said, it is getting more accessible for a broader array of conditions. But I want to talk about, so you mentioned Harborside, and Harborside obviously was famous for being on Weed Wars, the television program. Can you tell me a little bit about how that program came about and also some of the struggles involved with Harborside being such a trailblazer in the dispensary space?
Well, great questions. Weed Wars came about because some producers thought that they could get a docu-series greenlit in Hollywood right around 2010. They approached us, I think it was. And at that time, we were the highest volume dispensary ever and in the world, and we were seeing over 1,000 patients a day. And they saw that as a great story, and so did we. So it wasn't hard to get me and my brother to agree to have cameras following us around. As I mentioned, I went to acting school, so it was great to be able to express what we were doing to a wide audience. We didn't know if it would get greenlit by Hollywood, so first we had to make what is called a sizzle reel, which is like a 2 or 5 minute version of what you're going to do, and then they shopped around Hollywood, and the Discovery Channel greenlit the series and funded it to the tune of, oh gosh, I don't know, a couple $1 million probably, maybe less than that. I'm not sure. And we were not compensated monetarily in any way, but it was a way for us to showcase our dispensary and our community and what we were doing, and show the world that what we were doing was good, not bad. It was good for the community, not harmful, and that it, we're just regular guys doing this. We're not PhDs or anyone like that, and so if we can do it, other people in other communities can do it too. That was the real message we were hoping to send, and I think it worked, because to this day, as you've just asked me about it now, it aired almost a decade ago now, and there's been dozens of reality cannabis shows since, but
Mm,
it was the first one, and I think it really made people comfortable talking about cannabis in their communities and starting their own businesses. I hope, in their families and in their own way, and so I think it moved things forward a little bit. Yeah.
And then what about the kind of hurdles you encountered while running Harborside?
Well, whenever you're the first to do something, it's hard. There's one, you don't know what to do right, so you make a lot of mistakes, and two, sometimes the community reacts in ways you don't expect. Then there's also things like technology. There was no point of sale system for cannabis, so how do you get a computer system that helps you, you know, keep track of your sales and make a good experience for your customers that they're used to for other businesses from other businesses. So just that alone, we dogged us for years. We couldn't find reliable, and then we kept crashing because we had high volume, and then we'd have to do handwritten receipts, and that was a bummer for our customers. And then we're giving away free things so people will not be so upset with us. So all those kind of trials and tribulations. And then, of course, we had attacks by the federal government. The federal government attacked us in tax court. They attacked us in forfeiture court and tried to shut us down and basically kill us. So that was probably, obviously the biggest battle. But we won all those battles, or at least we didn't win the tax battle, but we're going to be able to absorb it. Um, and we're still standing. Harborside's still standing, still doing what it does. So, and we pioneered things like lab testing. There was never lab testing, and and that was hard on our community. A lot of our growers didn't like that. A lot of our producers and vendors said, well, "Oh, now I have to pass a lab test. I'll just go sell it to somebody else who doesn't require that," because it wasn't required by law. It was something we were doing. We wanted people to know what was in it. So whenever you pioneer things, sometimes you get a few arrows in the back, and that's no exception for Harborside. But it is also, that's how change happens. That's how progress happens. That's how we get things done. That's how we move the ball forward in all of this. We're still in the early embryonic stages of cannabis legalization and coming out of the shadows and into the light. So um, plenty more to do. Plenty more to do.
Mm. Yeah, it seems like you've taken a really, whether intentionally or otherwise, you've taken a really multifaceted approach to changing the perception of cannabis. Having a dispensary that is legitimate, that is, as I've read, well lit, not kind of this dank, like dark area. You've got a point of sale system, you're doing lab testing. So it's introducing all of these familiar elements to an otherwise unfamiliar territory. And then it being on television as well helps to normalize it. In addition to your legalization efforts, it's all one big collective attempt to make cannabis just like alcohol, except slightly different because it has many more benefits and many less risks than alcohol. Was that ever like a conscious decision of yours to be like, I want to do this TV show, I want to make this dispensary purely for the purposes of changing the perception of cannabis, not just selling it, but also showing people, even if they're not consumers of it, but so they're not critics of it, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, that's been part of the operating system. Even when we had the hemp clothing company, we were trying to normalize this. Look, you can make blue jeans out of it. And in those days, we thought maybe industrial hemp was going to have its moment in the '90s. It's now having its moment. Okay, so we were sometimes you pioneer something a little too early. But yeah, it's always about changing the perception. Our strategic approach is always about changing the perception of cannabis. Yeah, we want to be able to do our trade, but it's the more our perception of the plant goes from negative to positive, the more trade we can do. So, and maybe we have to give a big chunk of that trade to the tax collectors, which we have to do in the United States, certainly in California. But that's the cost of doing business legally, and so I think that's a fine price to pay. I don't want it to be so high that our people can't afford it and that customers can't afford it and patients can't afford it and we can't compete with the traditional or underground markets, So we have to be really mindful in the way in which we do these things. But we're growing up. It's all part of the perception changing. Now in the United States, you've got 90% support for medical cannabis, which is extraordinary. This is a very conservative country politically, and to have 90% support on anything, you can't get 90% on this. The world is round in the United States right now. So it's extraordinary, the consensus that we have on medical. On adult use, I think it's 60%, or maybe a little higher now, 65%, I think the latest polls are. And that's extraordinary in and of itself, too. So it's going to be like that soon in places like where you live. And when that happens, it's how can elected officials and leaders of countries, hold it back at a certain point? The will of the people will manifest.
Yeah, well, there's also there's having seen cannabis legalization for quite a long period and an accelerating rate of legalization. There are more examples of its benefits now than there were during the war on drugs, obviously, because everything was kind of under the surface. So even to use Illinois as an example, they are on track to generate $1 billion in cannabis sales for this year alone, for 12 months. So even if you're not passionate about the plant and its ability to help people or its recreational benefits, even from a purely monetary angle, if you're a government and it's coronavirus and you're looking for tax revenue, which I think was a large motivator for New York during coronavirus, they needed tax revenue and generating it quickly. You can look at cannabis and say, if nothing else, this will generate us a significant amount of money, and we can put that to whatever cause we see fit, which in some cases is, as you mentioned, restoring the well-being of the people impacted during the war on drugs. So, if nothing else, cannabis is lucrative, and I hope that countries like Australia and places like Europe will be able to look at New York and Colorado and Illinois and say, look, they're doing it. No one's dying. They're making a lot of money. A lot of medical patients and children, in a lot of cases, are having their lives changed for the better. They're really, and the war on drugs just doesn't work. That should be point number one, probably.
Yeah.
But there really isn't that great of a justification at all anymore. You can't. The propaganda has been proven false.
I agree. I mean, it's a money maker. It's a job creator. It's a sustainability engine. If we allow it to be grown outside, it's a great carbon sequester. Anything you can make out of timber or petroleum or cotton, you can pretty much make out of hemp and other plants. So this is the great renaissance that's before us. And you're right. The plant's been studied to death. It clearly has medical benefits. It clearly has lots of other industrial and other benefits. And it has economic benefits. So really, the only thing that's holding us back is a bunch of superstition. And because any harms that cannabis may cause, we know how to deal with them. We know how to we know how to deal with them. We know how to lab test cannabis. We know how to create child-proof packaging. We know how to make all that biodegradable. Our industry is far ahead of sustainable packaging than conventional industries. Far ahead, because our consumers demand it, and soon the law will make you have sustainable packaging. That's just going to be the law of every land soon enough. With global warming, we won't have a choice. So I don't. It's just superstition and stigma that's really holding all of this promise, all of this tremendous promise, economic promise. Just talk about that. It's 225,000 people employed in the United States alone. We have only about 50,000 in the coal miners. We only have about 50,000 coal miners. We have 4 times as many coal miners and cannabis employees as we do coal miners. We have more cannabis employees than we do electrical engineers. So, and these are good paying jobs. Even entry level, you're talking about substantially higher than minimum wage. You're talking about, as long as you don't leave the company in 90 days or 6 months or a year, you're going to get health care and retirement benefits in the cannabis industry in the United States. These are good jobs, and this plant is demanding. It's labor intensive, and to get it into every medicine cabinet or belly or skim product or hempcrete or building on earth or clothes, well, that's going to require millions of people employed with those well-paying jobs, and it could really be transformative for communities and entire countries. We have a terrible problem in California with wildfires. I know you have that problem there too. Well, hemp grows a deep root in 90 days, and that can really help when a fire comes through. You can plant hemp behind it a lot of times, especially if the climate's right. And then in 90, you've got something that's holding that land together until the trees grow back. And so the rain doesn't wash it away. So there's just so many things we can do with this plant once we shake off that stigma and superstition. I agree with you. I think it's really there's no logical reason anymore.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that mentality shift has basically occurred in like you said, a majority of people in polling supports this. I think at this point it's largely like momentum in favor of prohibition, where people are just like, well, why change what's already happening? And I think that will change over time. Um, and yeah, I just think within 5, 10 years, I can see it being federally legal in the US. Not as soon as I had expected. I don't know if you're the same, but with the Biden election and Democrats controlling the House and the Senate, it was like all lights are green at the moment. And then there were a few hiccups with he fired some staff for having smoked weed. I'm sure you saw that.
That was
He,
outrageous. Yeah, I
he
agree with
formed,
you. I'm in the 5 to 10 year camp too. I just don't see Biden doing it in term
mm,
one unless we put enough pressure on him, and unless they're smart enough to run those bills right before the midterms, because that'll get people out if they do that.
yeah, 100%. And on that note, given the damages done by the war on drugs, and which I think is a huge motivating factor for anyone involved in cannabis to kind of alleviate or rectify the harms done. I want to talk about your T-shirt, Last Prisoner Project. Can you
Yeah,
tell me a bit about what the project is and why you've kind of jumped on board with that?
sure. Well, in the United States, we have a terrible problem with about 40,000 plus people still locked up for cannabis crimes in pretty harsh circumstances. Our prisons and jails here are terrible environments for anybody to be in, let alone a nonviolent person that's in jail for something that's not really a crime anymore in most states in this country. So, and there's an awful lot of people who are making an awful lot of money doing the exact same thing legally that these folks that are locked up did. So my brother and I started with some other folks, started Last Prisoner Project a couple years ago. The mission's very simple: get everyone who's locked up, not just in the United States, but all over the world, for weed out of prison, get their record expunged or erased, and re-enter them into society. And our organization is a nonprofit, and we raise funds from individuals. We raise funds from cannabis companies, both large and small. We have a plethora of programs that any cannabis company in the world, or any company in the world that's even not a cannabis company, can participate in and get the benefits of a nonprofit tax write-off. And we've had a little bit of success. We've gotten a couple dozen people out with other organizations and a whole bunch of other donors and stakeholders and people all working together. A lot of organizations, not just ours, doing this work. But we have a long way to go. So that's Last Prisoner Project. People can learn more about it at lastprisonerproject.org. We even have a program where you can write a letter to a prisoner, and we connect people up with that. Which I find being a pen pal to a prisoner is a really rewarding thing to do. Once you
Mm,
start writing to somebody, you often are friends for life.
mm,
And I can tell you from someone who's been locked up, not for long periods of time, but for enough to know what it feels like, that a letter is a real lifeline when you get a letter from somebody when you're locked up. So um, that's Last Prisoner Project, and I hope that someday we'll be an international organization. Right now, we're just American.
mm. Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. And where can people find the rest of your work?
Check out my website, andrewdeangelo.com, and lastprisonerproject.org. Those are probably the two best places. I'm all over LinkedIn and all the social media, Andrew_DeAngelo.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Andrew. It's been a pleasure. You've done more work. We've only really scratched the surface of what you've done in the cannabis industry. So I hope people look really in depth at what you've done and the amazing progress that you've initiated in this space. And yeah, I look forward to speaking to you soon.
Thank you. It was great to join CanMar this morning.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, that's a wrap on another episode of the CanMar Morning Talk Show, this time with Andrew DeAngelo. I hope you enjoyed that episode, and we want to thank you for stopping by and sitting down with us. As always, remember to check us out on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, as well as checking out the CanMar Hub community space on LinkedIn for enthusiasts, educators, and professionals alike. Until next time, CanMar is bringing you endless possibilities.